This video is brought to you by Ground News. It's fair to say that the housing situation in the UK isn't exactly ideal. With the government consistently missing their own housing targets, with rent prices increasing, and with NIMBYs blocking housing developments, it's easy for young renters to feel like they're getting a pretty bad deal. As such, the government is trying to alleviate at least some of these problems in a new bill they're pushing through Parliament, the Renters Reform Bill. So in this video, let's have a look at some of the problems the bill is trying to fix, how it aims to fix the problems, and ultimately, whether this will be enough to solve Britain's renting crisis. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. In the policy background section of the government's own explanatory notes for the bill, they explain that the size of the renting sector has increased massively in the last 2 decades to about 4.6 million households, equivalent to about 11 million people. Now, it's not even that the number of people renting has changed, it's that the composition of those that rent has changed too. While renting has always been something that younger people and students tend to do, part of this uptick in renters has actually come from older tenants and families. Data from the Office for National Statistics shows that people in their mid-30s and mid-40s are now more likely to rent than before. Back in 1997, fewer than 10% of people in this age bracket rented their home. By 2017, this had increased to 33%. The ONS additionally claims that if this trend continues, then more people will be living in the private rental sector in the future. So, with more and more people renting, and with the demographics of renters changing too, the government has accepted that changes need to be made to make renting fairer for tenants. This is where the Renters Reform Bill comes in. There are 3 main changes that the bill aims to make, in order to make renting fairer: ending Section 21, or no-fault evictions, creating a new database of landlords, and finally, and most importantly, giving tenants the right to own a pet. So let's have a look through each of these changes in turn, starting with Section 21 no-fault evictions. Now, there'll be many of you watching who are wondering exactly what a Section 21 notice actually is, which is understandable. It's not exactly a descriptive term. It refers to a part of the 1988 Housing Act which allows private landlords to kick tenants out, without having to prove that there's any fault on the behalf of a tenant. This applies both if the tenant is on a rolling tenancy or if they're on a fixed contract with a break clause. Now, the government is changing this so that landlords cannot evict anyone without a reason. Or at least that's what they've said. Looking into the bill, Ruby Hinchcliffe from The Telegraph discovered a loophole in the bill that allows landlords to evict tenants without reason. In essence, the landlord simply needs to claim that they're going to sell the property, and the tenant will then move out. The landlord doesn't actually then need to proceed with a sale, and is allowed to, only 3 months later, relist the property. So while the theory behind scrapping Section 21 notices sounds good on paper, it seems that the execution of this could do with some work. In addition to this, the government is also changing how tenancies actually work, again in order to try and prevent landlords removing tenants without good reason. Currently, most tenancies are assured short-hold tenancies, whereby the tenant signs a contract for 6, 12 or 24 months. At the end of this, the landlord can decide whether to offer another tenancy. The Renters Reform Bill will move all of these existing tenancies onto a rolling tenancy, whereby the tenancy simply continues at the beginning of each month. The only way these rolling tenancies end is when the tenant gives the landlord 2 months' notice. Of course, some of these rolling tenancies do exist currently, but they're just not the most common type. This gives tenants a lot more security, and readdresses the power in their favour over when the tenancy comes to an end. So let's move on and have a look at the inverse, and the new landlord database. In essence, the database will serve 2 purposes. Firstly, it'll give landlords a single portal where they can find all the information they need about renting out a property. This includes information about their responsibilities. Second, it'll increase transparency for tenants, most notably before they agree to enter a tenancy agreement. Now, how useful this will be depends very much on what information is actually made publicly available about each landlord. If, for example, information about deposits, previous rent increases, and compliance issues are made available, then this could be very useful. If it's simply information about a landlord's property portfolio, then it'll be slightly less useful. Right now, the government has not actually made clear what information will be included in this database, only that landlords will be required to sign up to it. Whether this will help tenants then is not entirely clear just yet. Moving on to the final major change introduced in the Renters Reform Bill, the right for tenants to keep pets. Now, this is something that's received a lot of attention in the press, and to be fair, understandably so. Right now, landlords have no obligation to allow their tenants to keep pets in their properties. This obviously makes it very hard for those already with a pet to find a new property, and it also prevents the vast majority of people who rent from getting a pet. The bill changes this and only allows landlords to deny their tenants from owning a pet if there's a reasonable reason to do so. Now, in the guidance on this, the government actually makes clear that it would not be possible to legislate for every situation where a landlord would or would not be able to reasonably refuse a pet. So it's not clear exactly what these reasonable situations would be, but presumably allergies of the landlord or other tenants could be one way that a landlord could refuse tenants from keeping pets. Now, this change isn't all that revolutionary, but to many, it'll be a welcome change and could make a significant change in their experience of renting. So now we've gone through the main changes, it's worth asking, will this actually fix the renting situation in the UK? Well, none of these changes actually try to structurally change anything. It won't change the costs of renting, nor will it massively discourage people from becoming landlords. Instead, it's trying to improve the experience of renting. And to be fair, we don't even know if it'll do that. The devil is very much in the details, and it depends on whether the government closes the loophole on evicting tenants without cause, and exactly what information is included in the landlord database. And while Sunak seems to be quite comfortable within his party, on the other side of the political spectrum, in the Labour Party, Starmer appears to be struggling. On this story about Keir Starmer's position in the Israel-Gaza conflict, 55% of the reporting is coming from the left and 36% is coming from the right. If you compare the headlines, you'll start to see some interesting framing emerge. On the left, you have one source quoting Starmer saying that a Gaza ceasefire is not the correct position now. And on the right, you have another source, again quoting Starmer, saying that a permanent ceasefire could risk even more violence. This is all possible thanks to our sponsor Ground News, a website and app developed by a former NASA engineer on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read the news. Every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality and ownership of the source's reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organisations. For example, for the story on Israeli tanks in Gaza, you can see the bias distribution for every news outlet reporting on it, the complete factuality information and the ownership data. I especially like the blind spot feed, which highlights stories that are disproportionately covered by one side of the political spectrum. And this is where information like the factuality score or ownership information becomes so important. Because sometimes there's a reason that only one side of the political spectrum is reporting on a story. But at the end of the day, isn't it important to see stories like this, even if we might disagree with them? I know I've personally benefited enormously from Ground News. I've gotten much better at spotting political bias, and I've surprisingly challenged some of my own views. I highly encourage all of our viewers to give Ground News a try. In fact, we're offering 30% off their Vantage plan to all viewers. That's under $6 a month for unlimited access to every incredible Ground News feature. This offer is only available here, so make sure you go to ground.news/TLDR or click the link in the description to get started and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.